Hi everybody, Mr. Chris here. You know, comics like we used to read in newspapers back when we read newspapers were just great. And one of my personal favorites was Calvin and Hobbes, and I hope you're familiar with them. Here's a great Calvin and Hobbes strip that is fitting for school this time of the year. So, this is kind of getting toward the tail end of the school year, and summer vacation is so close you can just smell it. And so I was looking for a school themed Calvin and Hobbes to show to you. So, all right, here's Calvin sitting in school. And Miss Wormwood, he asks, could we arrange our seats in a circle and have a little discussion? And so as a teacher, I'm always either overjoyed or deeply suspicious when students ask if we could have a discussion. And so, if I'm elated, I'm thinking, wow, the kids really want to dig into this topic. Or if I'm suspicious sometimes because the discussions seem to come up at times that would be pretty advantageous for the students, such as a big assignment coming up or some difficult topic or a test or something. Anyway, so let's go on to the next panel here. So Calvin is asked to have a discussion. And then here's his topic. Specifically, I'd like to debate whether cannibalism ought to be grounds for leniency in murders since it's less wasteful. So terrible. Now, of course, we wait with bated breath to see how the crotchety old Miss Wormwood is going to react to Calvin. And so let's take a look at the third panel here. And yes, there he is. Dunce hat in the corner. Poor guy. And he says, for some reason, they'd rather teach us stuff that any fool can look up in a book. And I really love this one because the way he summarizes everything that's taught in school as stuff any fool can look up in a book. So the great thing about our first grade hero Calvin here is that he thinks so far outside the box that the rest of society doesn't really know what to do with him, including his teacher in this case, Miss Wormwood. Because, if any first grade student actually asks a question like that, well, he's either crazy or a genius, one or the other. And Calvin in this case is just so far ahead of his time that Miss Wormwood doesn't know what to do with him, so she puts him in the corner. And I've always really wondered what Calvin would have grown up to be if he had actually grown up. But unfortunately, in this comic strip, he is perennially stuck at the tender age of 6 in first grade, and we never get to see what this lovable little creative imp would have grown up to be. So anyway, welcome to English class. Before we get started, make sure you have your grammar and composition work, text, and pencil. Pause the video and grab those things if you do not have them. Okay, let's cover your assignments for today. So first, here are your assignments that are due today, Monday, May 4 at 8:30 a.m. In grammar, that would be pages 198 to 201. In lit, you simply had to hit turn in Microsoft Teams to acknowledge that you read the final 2 pieces in your lit book called Evensong and How Did You Die? In VSP, that would be the list 28 spelling words written 5 times. Second, here are your new assignments for today. These assignments are all due on Wednesday, May 6 at 8:30 a.m. In grammar, that would be pages 202 to 204. In lit, there is no assignment. In VSP, that would be writing the list 28 vocab words and definitions 1 time. Okay, tests and quizzes for today. There are these are due today, Monday, May 4 at 3 o'clock p.m. In grammar, you have a quiz 15, which covers Unit 13, pages 176 to 186, pronouns. In lit, you have Test 11, which covers simply Unit 11. Let's move on to our grammar here, so our grammar lesson for today. So would you please get your work text and turn to page 202. Okay, today we're tackling sentence improvement, and we'll be working with the concepts of conciseness, subordination, using active voice, parallelism, and clear pronoun reference. Now remember, becoming a good, clear writer is really the point of English class. It's a huge step for you toward becoming a good communicator. So are any of you going to become professional writers? The chances of that happening are pretty slim. At most, you may end up doing some writing that might get published in a newsletter or something, but you probably are not going to be a person who makes a living writing. There's very, very small chance of that. Possibly, but probably not. So why go through all of this work to try to learn to write properly? Well, the answer for that is that every single job that you're ever going to hold is going to require you to communicate. So the better you are at organizing your thoughts and at presenting your ideas, the more effective you're going to be at work. And that can be as simple as if you have some task or some tasks that you do with the rest of your family, like if you work with your family, or if you have some tasks that you do at some job that doesn't really seem that complicated, there's still going to be a lot of communication that has to take place. And I am just going to give you a little anecdote here, a little story that illustrates this. So when I was 17 and 18, or 18 and 19 and 20 years old, 18 and 19 years old, I worked at a mill making a mill that made trim, and also did some custom milling things. So we hung doors, produced trim like that goes on the walls and stuff. And I was working on a machine that would take pieces of board that were about that thick, about that wide, and it would cut them in two. And so you had two pieces of board that were now about that thick each. And there's a certain way that they actually were kind of cut on an angle, and they were then turned into molding that would be put on the wall, like around doors or on windows and things like that. Well, anyway, there was this particular way that I had to stack those things. And the person that was trying to explain to me how the stacking was supposed to be done was not very good at explaining what he was looking for. And I remember I was trying so hard to understand what he was saying. And he went over the process with me several times, but like he was really unclear with what he was saying, and I just could not understand it. And there's a certain sort of way that he wanted me to take the boards off of the machine as they came off, and a certain way he wanted me to flip them and stuff, and I just could not get what he was saying. And I remember finally seeing the look of utter disgust on his face as he explained it to me for the third time. And I remember being so super frustrated with him because I felt like I was stressed out because I wanted to make him happy, but I also was stressed out because I didn't understand what he was trying to say, and I knew if the process started, I wouldn't be able to do it correctly, and then he'd be angry again. And so even with a really easy process like trying to split boards in half, it's super, super important that you know how to communicate your ideas well. So I know some of you are already holding jobs, and some of you are going to be holding jobs as the summer moves on here and school lets out. And your ability to communicate well is going to be super important to everything that you do. I'm going to give you one more example because this one is going to be more real life for some of you. So Steffi, my wife, has been working in a combine now for, I think she did it 3 or 4 years before we got married, and then she did it again last summer. She worked part-time combining for a local farmer. And something that I noticed when I was riding with her in the combine was that that communication is really, really important when she is in the combine. And again, combining isn't that complicated of a task. To people back east, like in Ohio, when they would find out that Steffi drove a combine, they would be really amazed, because to people from the east, combine driving is a really complicated task. It's like no one has combines in the farms in Ohio, because it's all the farmland is on a hill and you couldn't drive a combine in there. So to us, combining is really complicated. But to people here, you understand that combining is actually not really complicated. It's a really slow and sort of somewhat boring process. Yet, I did discover from riding with Steffi in the combine cab that being able to communicate clearly and to communicate succinctly is actually extremely important to be able to make the whole operation work well. So a couple of things that I noticed that Steffi has to do when she's in the combine is that she has to tell people, she has to communicate with the other combine drivers to tell them how full her bin is. And then she has to communicate with the truck driver so the truck driver can come alongside of her combine so that she can unload into the back of the truck. And then depending on how good the truck driver is at like watching in his mirror to see where the combine boom is and how full the truck is, Steffi has to be even better at communicating with him whether he, or I guess it could be a she in the truck too, whether he or she needs to pull up or back up or slow down or whatever. And so also if there's any issues that develop while Steffi's in the combine, she has to be able to summarize what's going on and to communicate that using the CB radio to the head farmer so that he can then decide what needs to be done. And so there's a lot of communication that goes on there. And the same thing is true for any job that you're going to hold. It can be extremely frustrating to work with someone who is simply not able to communicate what is going on, no matter how simple the job. And so the whole point of these exercises, and actually really the whole point of English, is teaching you how to be a good communicator. And I have learned from experience that learning how to write well really leads to learning how to speak well as well. And so becoming a good, clear writer in English class is going to lead to you becoming a good, clear communicator when you are also on the job. So secondly, not only are you going to need to be a good communicator on the job to provide for your family or yourself, but you actually are going to need to be a good communicator in almost every aspect of your life. You already are part of a family, and you already live with other people in a house, and you probably have noticed that if the communication breaks down in the house, things can go badly very quickly. And that becomes especially true once you get married, or once you sort of if you live with some other roommates that are not your family members, then communication becomes extremely crucial. So I've lived in several different sort of circumstances. I grew up with my family up until I was 19, and then I went to college, and I lived in a dorm with a couple other guys. And then I moved back in with my family for a while. Then I lived by myself for a bit. Then I got married. And so I've had a couple different experiences with living situations. And I've noticed that trying to live together with a group of people, or even just with my wife, requires a tremendous amount of communication. And if the communication does in fact break down, things can go badly very quickly. And so being able, again, to straighten out your thoughts, to get them into some clear way, or that you can then convey to somebody else, is really going to help you a lot. And so that's really the point of English class here, and especially the point of an assignment like we're tackling today, where we're working entirely on just developing your ability to write. And so just remember, when you're working on your ability to write, we're not just working on your ability to write, we're working on your ability to communicate well. Okay, let's move on. So go to exercise A on page 202. On page 202, go to exercise A, and here in exercise A, we're going to be working with conciseness. And so remember, conciseness means saying more with fewer words. So here are your instructions. Reduce each pair of sentences to one sentence containing the construction called for in parentheses. So let's go to number one. Number one says, Simon de Montfort wanted to reform the English government. He assembled a representative parliament. Okay, so what is the work text calling for here in parentheses? The construction they're calling for is a participial phrase. Okay, so what is a participial phrase? Just recall that a participial phrase is a verbal phrase used as an adjective. So here's an example of a participial phrase. Fearing the neighbor's Rottweiler, Amber steered far clear of the neighbor's front porch. So the participial phrase in that sentence is fearing the neighbor's Rottweiler. So it begins with that ing, fearing. The neighbor's Rottweiler often begins with ing. Participial phrases often begin with that ing word at the beginning, fearing. Okay, which of the two sentences in number one could be reduced to a participial phrase? So if we're looking at those two, I would suggest that maybe we could say wanting to reform the English government. That would work well. So that's perfect. Let's assemble the whole sentence. So here we go. First off, the participial phrase, wanting to reform the English government, and now we tack on the other sentence. Simon de Montfort assembled a representative parliament. Okay, that is actually your answer. It's going to be on the screen, so pause the video and copy that down for number one. Okay, that was beautiful. So so we took a very awkward sounding two sentences and we made them much shorter, much punchier. So nicely done. Let's go on to number two. Number two, Simon de Montfort was an English statesman and soldier. Montfort died in the Battle of Evesham, or Evesham, I'm not sure which. Okay, what is the work text calling for this time? In parentheses, it's calling for the construction of an appositive phrase. So, an appositive phrase. This one is all yours. Give it your best shot. All right, let's move on to exercise B. For this exercise, we are dealing with subordination. So let me just quickly remind you of three different types of superhero sentences. There's the Superman sentence. That's a simple sentence. Just one clause. It's simple. It's powerful. There's no sidekick. The Superman sentence delivers a super powerful punch, right? Use these sentences when you have a simple point to make, or just one simple point to make, or a really emphatic point to make or something. All right, so that's the Superman sentence. Then there's the Avengers sentence, and this is the compound sentence. This sentence is more complicated. It's got multiple clauses going on. It's got a full lineup of really powerful characters, but it can easily cause destruction and chaos when it's not used correctly, because there's simply too much power in there. So in an Avengers sentence, a compound sentence, the question is who's in charge? Who can take who in a fight? Who gets to call the shots? It's all a little bit too much going on. And so the Avengers sentences should be used sparingly and with care, even less than the Superman sentence. And finally, there's the Batman and Robin sentence. This is called the complex sentence. It also conveys a lot of information like the Avengers sentence, but there's a big difference between an Avengers sentence and a Batman and Robin sentence. And that difference is that with the Batman and Robin sentence, it's obvious who's in control. It's Batman. He's the independent clause. Then there's Robin, the sidekick, and he's the dependent clause. So again, what's going on in an Avengers sentence, in a compound sentence, is that you have two independent clauses, bam and bam. But then in a Batman and Robin or a complex sentence, you have an independent clause and a dependent clause. And the independent clause states the more important thing, while the dependent clause states the less important thing. All right, so together, Batman and Robin, the independent and the dependent clause can really work miracles, but it's all, and convey a lot of information, but it's all in a nice, sleek, neat, and under control situation. And so you want to use these sentences a lot. And I've noticed that for students to be able to write well, they really have to learn how to do this particular thing well. Okay, so those are your three superhero sentences: Superman, the Avengers, Batman and Robin. And in this section, we're working on crafting nice, sleek, smooth Batman and Robin sentences. Exercise B, here are your instructions. Combine each pair of sentences into one sentence by making one of the sentences into a dependent clause. That's Robin. You will need to introduce the dependent clause with words like after, although, as, because, before, since, or when. Use a comma after the dependent clause, Robin, if the dependent clause is at the beginning of the sentence. Okay, let's begin here. So I'm really excited for this because, like I mentioned before, this is one of my absolute favorite writing exercises. The transformation of multiple awkward sounding sentences into beautiful, sleek, complex sentences with proper subordination. While it sounds really nerdy and kind of complicated, that actually is pretty much one of the biggest keys to you becoming a good, successful writer. Okay, so let's go to number one. Most mosses grow in damp areas. Some mosses grow in dry, warm places. Okay, so we've got two separate Superman sentences here, and we are going to take these two separate Superman sentences, and we're going to make one of the sentences Batman being the most important one, and we're going to make one of them Robin being the less important one. So the big question is, which one is Batman and which one is Robin? So remember, Batman is large and in charge. It's the independent clause. It's the most important part. It's the more important of the two different sentences, while Robin is the sidekick. It's going to be the less important of the two sentences. So we have to choose which one of these is more important. So I'm actually going to pick the first sentence to be more important. And the reason for that is that it talks about most mosses in that sentence. And while on the other hand, the other sentence is only talking about some mosses. So I'm going to take the most mosses as being the more important sentence. Let's go ahead and put this one together. So we've got to we've got a list of introductory words there in our instructions. And so let's try the first one. So how about after some mosses grow in dry, warm places, most mosses grow in damp areas? But that doesn't make any sense, right? Because that doesn't happen that way. These things are growing concurrently. So let's move on to the next word. How about although some mosses grow in dry, warm places, most mosses grow in damp areas? That makes much more sense. Now you could, and that is correct, but you could also argue that I picked the wrong sentence to turn into Batman and the wrong sentence to turn into Robin. So if we'd actually switched that around, we could, it would sound like this. Although most mosses grow in damp areas, some mosses grow in dry, warm places. And that actually would work. And you could even argue that that's even better, because maybe what's really going on in this sentence, maybe what's more important here is to talk about the mosses that are less common. Like maybe that's the more important thing we want to talk about. So in this case, either one of those answers is actually going to be fine, and I'm going to be putting those up on the screen in just a bit for you to copy. But I do want to highlight one more thing yet before I put it up on the screen, and that is that the important thing for an exercise such as this one is not to find a single answer that is correct. And I wanted to sort of reiterate something, because I've noticed that, especially as students are transferring from an individualized curriculum like ACE to something like this, that is not something like this, in which there's not necessarily one correct answer. Students have a difficult time navigating that, because you have so far until this school started, most of you have been working with an individualized curriculum in which you had like one answer you were looking for, and you would go check the answer key to see if the answer you selected was actually that correct answer. If it wasn't, you'd go back and you get the correct answer. And so that has sort of shaped, I think, your ideas about what's right and what's wrong as far as your work goes. So like there's one correct answer, but actually in English, there often isn't just one correct answer, such as in this case. And there's actually multiple things going on, and you simply have to create something that makes sense. And that you could argue is correct. And so anyway, just a little side note there about why it can be difficult for students making the transfer from ACE to this to actually comprehend this particular kind of little assignment here. Okay, so there's multiple ways to answer these questions, and either one of the examples that we just talked about would actually make a good answer. And as you're doing the rest of these, it's not important for you to find the right answer. It's important for you to find an answer that makes sense and sounds good. Okay, so here are the two answers that we came up with for number one. So pause the video and copy one of them down, whichever one you think sounds better, there into the blank. Okay, now you are ready to do number two and number three all by yourself, and I can't wait to see what you come up with. Like I said, this is probably one of the most important writing skills for you to learn, how to subordinate and how to create dependent or Robin clauses. Very important skill, and I really am excited to see what you come up with. Okay, next up is exercise C. This exercise deals with the active voice. Now, the active voice means that the subject of a sentence is doing the action, and it's much punchier than the passive voice, which is when the subject is getting things done to it. So let's go to number one. And oh yeah, I have a little thing I wanted to demonstrate. So the difference here is that in the passive voice, I'm getting punched. But in the active voice, I'm doing the punching. So it's much punchier. Okay, number one, the presidency was held by James Monroe during the era of good feelings. Okay, we need to use all the same key words. And I want to stress that, because I think I've seen some of you take a sentence like this and to create an active voice by removing like half of the sentence. And so you actually can't do that. What you need to do in this case is you actually need to maintain all the key words in the sentence. So like, let me just give you an example. So if you're supposed to take the sentence, the presidency was held by James Monroe during the era of good feelings, and make that an active, use the active voice, then some of you have done something like you've just said, James Monroe was president during the era of good feelings. Okay, now that actually is conveying pretty much the same information, right? But that actually is not quite what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to continue using the same key words. And so you actually can't just say James Monroe was president. You have to say James Monroe held the presidency, right? So there's a bit of a difference there, and you've got to make sure you use the same key words. So make sure you do that as you do this exercise. Okay, so we got to use the same keywords, and we have to make James Monroe the active person here. And so I already kind of gave this in my earlier example when I was talking about using all the keywords. And so we're going to say James Monroe held the presidency during the era of good feelings. So that uses the same keywords. It also puts James Monroe in the subject, and there he is, good old Jimmy Monroe holding the presidency. So pause the video and copy down this sentence for number 1. Okay, number 2 and number 3 are going to be all yours, so slay some active voice here. All right, let's move on to exercise D. This time we're dealing with parallelism. So remember, parallel means when things line up like this, they're parallel. So parallelism in English or grammar is when each word, phrase, or clause in a series has the same structure and the same form. So let's take a look. Number 1, to represent his country's viewpoint and maintaining peaceful relations are 2 duties of an ambassador. So first off, we have to identify where several items are appearing in a series. So did you already notice them when we read it the first time? The items in the series are at the beginning of the sentence. They are to represent his country's viewpoint and maintaining peaceful relations. So what's the problem with these 2 items in the series? Well, the problem is that to represent his country's viewpoint is an infinitive phrase. Meanwhile, maintaining peaceful relations is a gerund phrase. And just a little time out here. I know I've talked about this in class before about gerund and gerund, and I was pronouncing things gerund before. And I was basing that off of many years ago, going through this discussion with somebody. And I'm not sure if I use a different dictionary, I'm not sure, but I don't know. I just went and looked this up, and the only pronunciation that I could find for this particular word, G-E-R-U-N-D, is gerund. Gerund did not appear at all. And so I'm going to switch my pronunciation over to simply gerund, and I propose that you do that as well. So sorry for misleading you on that one. Anyway, back to it. So maintaining peaceful relations is a gerund phrase. Now we've got to make either the infinitive phrase a gerund phrase or the gerund phrase an infinitive phrase. So you can take your pick. Take your pick there. I'm going to choose to make them both gerund phrases. So let's give it a shot. So representing his country's viewpoint and maintaining peaceful relations are 2 duties of an ambassador. That's beautiful. So pause the video, copy this down. Okay, numbers 2 through 5 are all yours. I hope you blow my socks off here. Okay, flip the page. Let's go to exercise E. This time we're dealing with clear pronoun reference. Well, we've been doing a lot of this over the last week or 2, so no further explanation is really needed, I think. So let's just go right to number 1. Number 1, we realized that flies and mosquitoes were out in force. This made a picnic seem undesirable. Okay, so to solve problems like this, we have to restate the sentence to avoid using the word this. That's the problem here. So let me just recap that. We realized that flies and mosquitoes were out in force. This made a picnic seem undesirable. So we've got a really sort of long, awkward sounding sentence here that states something and then heads into a second sentence entirely and then states something else. And it really wouldn't have to be. The 2 things are really very much connected, and you really don't need to have 2 separate sentences. Now, also note, just to connect it with something we were working with earlier, that what kind of sentence do we have here? This is an Avengers sentence. And in an Avengers sentence, there's a lot of chaos because there's just simply, this sentence is too long. There's just too much information kind of being conveyed in an unclear way. And so what we're going to do here is we're actually going to be changing this sentence into a nice, clear, I think maybe just a Superman sentence. And we're going to be avoiding using the word this. And so we're actually focusing here on fixing some shady pronoun reference going on. In this case, it's referring to the word this. but we're also working with making the sentence not an Avengers sentence. All right, so let's go ahead and get rolling here. So to solve one of these, we have to get rid of this entirely, and so let's see what we've got here. So let's take the first part of the sentence and turn it into a participial phrase. And so we're going to say realizing that flies. Sorry, not a participial phrase, a gerund phrase. We're going to say realizing that flies and mosquitoes were out in force, right? So it had said we realized that flies and mosquitoes were out in force. We're just going to turn that into saying realizing that flies and mosquitoes were out in force made a picnic seem undesirable, right? That's our answer. So it's going to be up on the screen there. Go ahead and copy it down. So we just entirely got rid of the this here. The sentence is a lot smoother. It's a lot punchier, and it just sounds a lot better, and is a much clearer. In a much clearer way conveys what's really going on. So realizing that flies and mosquitoes were out in force made a picnic seem undesirable. So go ahead and copy that one down. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude our grammar and composition lesson for today. And for that matter, that will actually conclude our English class for today. So to finish up, why don't we have another comic for the road? This one comes from another one of my very favorite comic strips called The Far Side. And if this one doesn't strike you funny in the least, then just Google Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Mr. Chris, out.